And without further ado, I would like to introduce Dana Lewis, who is someone that we've all been waiting eagerly to hear from. And she has a fascinating journey to tell us about, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what she has to tell us about how open source is changing healthcare. So I give you Dana. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being so awake and excited. I'm not sure I'm as awake as you are, but maybe by the end of this, we'll change that. I want to start by telling you about my journey to learning about open source, how I apply it to healthcare, and I'm hoping you leave thinking about how you might apply some of your skills to healthcare. But I want to point out something first, that you probably think that there are two kinds of people in the room. Those who appreciate binary jokes and those who do not. But, as relevant for this talk, there's actually two different kinds of people in the room. Those who naturally produce their own insulin, which is most of you, and those of us who do not, because we have type 1 diabetes. And I'm one of those people with type 1 diabetes. But when we start to talk about healthcare, whether you're coming from the tech perspective or the healthcare perspective, it is very, very common to think that it's easy. You know, with type 1 diabetes, you don't make insulin, so just inject it. Test your blood sugar, eat healthy, exercise. Who here does that? Who listens to their doctor when they say eat healthy and exercise? I saw a hand raised, good for you. But for most of us, it's harder than that, and with type 1 diabetes, it's really hard. And the other thing to remember is when you're diagnosed with a chronic disease, type 1 diabetes, you get cancer, you find out your child has cystic fibrosis, you name it, it's really hard because it's like getting struck by lightning. You have no chance to prepare. You have no idea it's coming. You just know from that moment on, everything is going to be really, really different and you have to figure it out. In the case of type 1 diabetes, part of the reason it's so hard is because it's not just insulin and food and exercise in your body. There's things like stress and excitement and adrenaline. So for example, right now, I'm really stressed and excited and all jammed up to talk with y'all, and my blood sugar's going up. And that's hard to measure. How do you dose insulin for the excitement of staring at a room full of people really early in a different time zone? It's kind of hard to do. And there's also the confusing fact that some things that make your blood sugar go up sometimes will also make your blood sugar go down sometimes. So that's why when you look at a line of a blood sugar graph of a person with type 1 diabetes, it's very easy to look at that and judge and say, wow, they're doing a bad job, or they're out of control, or just any kind of snap judgment. But the reality is there are so many non-measurable things that influence your blood sugar. And the insulin is not this instantaneous magic drug. It's great, it keeps us alive, but it takes 60 to 90 minutes to peak into your body. So if I see my blood sugar going up right now, and I choose to dose myself some insulin, it will take upwards of an hour for it to really kick in and to start to manage that blood sugar. And the kicker is, food hits your body in about 15 minutes. So can you imagine sitting down to eat something, deciding to eat, eating, dosing your insulin, the food kicks in 15 minutes, and you go up and up and up, but it takes 45 to 60 minutes before your blood sugar starts to come down. That's why the graph looks like that, and that's why diabetes is so hard. And a lot of us are fortunate to have access to some tools that help. Access to insulin is not a guarantee around the world. So getting access to insulin, number one, we're very, very lucky for most of us to be able to do that. We also have some tools like a continuous glucose monitor and an insulin pump. Those sound great. Instead of having to inject yourself multiple times a day, you've got something clipped on your hip that will infuse insulin into your body on a regular basis. And a continuous glucose monitor that'll tell you your blood sugar every 5 minutes. What more could you possibly want? Well, the challenge is with what I call manual diabetes, with the setup that I just described, you have to do a lot of work. You have to pull the receiver out of your pocket, press a button, look at the number, look at the trend of what's happening. You have to pull out your insulin pump and see what has been dosed, when, how long, etc. You have to decide, what am I doing? Am I eating? Am I exercising? Am I giving a talk? What am I going to have to do? And you have to make a decision and decide to dose more or less insulin or eat, and do that over and over and over and over and over again throughout the day. An average person with type 1 diabetes makes hundreds of decisions a day that affects their blood sugar. It's not always about dosing insulin, but choosing to eat or not to eat, or what exactly you eat, or when to exercise, or do I need to eat a snack before I go? It's a lot of work and it's really, really hard. And that's why it's very common to see graphs of a continuous glucose monitor that looks like this. And the reason I show you this particular screenshot is because it's also very hard as a person with diabetes to get your data off these devices. In 2013, my endocrinologist said, hey, can you bring in a week's worth of your data? And I said, okay, sure. And I went away and I was like, wait a second. The FDA-approved software for my medical device only works for PC, and I have a Mac. What am I supposed to do? Can't get my data off my device. It is incredibly frustrating. The other key problem with the devices is that they're dumb and they don't talk to each other because they're made by different manufacturers. And in healthcare, you don't expect different manufacturers to play nice with one another. So these devices are dumb, they don't talk to each other, so that leaves me as the human in the middle making all of the decisions, doing all of this work. And even more importantly, I have a special superhuman trait that probably tops all of you. I am the world's best sleeper. I will sleep long and hard, and I will ignore every alarm in existence, including the one on my medical device, because it's been making the same alarm that I can't change for 5 years. So there's something called alarm fatigue, where you get really used to hearing it, and your body stops paying attention to it. So I would sleep through the alarm on this. So this is designed that if my blood sugar does go low, to alarm. But if you're sleeping and you don't hear it, the pump is still giving you insulin, and you're just going to go lower and lower and lower. So that led to a very terrible scenario for me where I was afraid to go to sleep at night. Can you imagine going to sleep and worrying that you're not going to wake up alive the next morning? That's what it's like for a lot of us with type 1 diabetes. It's not just, okay, we have to do a lot of work. We are at risk of dying every single day. Because even if you do everything right, your body reacts to exercise differently. So if you run a marathon, you might be sensitive for multiple days afterwards. So even if you do everything right, you take your insulin, you count your carbs, you eat healthy, you exercise, you do everything they say, it is still possible that you can die in the short term and in the long term with diabetes. That's really incredibly frustrating. And back in 2013 and 2014, I got so fed up with the fact that I couldn't even change the lousy alarm on this thing. But I had an idea. If we can't change this, what if we could design a system that would solve the problem? What if we could make our own louder alarms? We could take the data off the device, run it through the cloud down to my phone. My phone will wake me up. But wait, how do I get the data off my device? I couldn't, and so I was stuck. But that changed in 2013. I actually found somebody on Twitter, a gentleman named John Kostick, who posted a photo of one of these receivers plugged into a phone or computer and showing how it went up to the cloud, across town, and down to his computer at work so he could see his son's blood sugar from afar. And the light bulb really went off. I was like, ooh, if he would share his code with me, we could build my louder alarm system. Let's do it. But keep in mind, I come from a communications background. Not an engineer or programmer by training, knew nothing about open source. So I started talking about it with my now husband, Scott Librand, and I was like, I wonder if he'd share his code with us, which is like a crazy question in this room, I know. But think about everybody who doesn't know about open source. You don't know until you ask. So we asked and said, hey, would you share this with us? And he said yes. So with his code, we were able to plug this into an old Windows laptop that would sit by my bedside at night, run the data into Dropbox every 5 minutes, up to the cloud, use an app called Pushover to send an alarm down to my phone. It worked so well. I think in the first month, I had something like 200 alarms that I actually heard and woke up to. It was fantastic. But we decided to do other things too. Once we pulled the data off, we could do all kinds of really cool things. We built a very simple, ugly, terrible looking dashboard that was terribly effective because even at 3 o'clock in the morning, if my blood sugar was 50, I could read that and see, here's what my blood sugar is, here's what it's going to be, and here's what action I need to take. Now, my loved ones were a little concerned that if I wake up and my blood sugar was low, I might do kind of the opposite thing that I should be doing, because when your blood sugar is low, your brain is kind of weird. So that we put buttons on the system, so I could say, here's what I'm doing. I'm eating, I'm taking more insulin, I'm taking less insulin. And we also decided that the point of this display was not for them to be my primary caregivers. I'm an adult, I can handle myself. I wanted them to be my secondary line of defense. If I did not wake up to the alarm, then it should alarm them. So ideally, it would alarm, I'd wake up, and I'd press the button that would essentially snooze the system and say, don't wake everybody else up. It was great. And we jokingly called the system DIYPS, the do-it-yourself pancreas system, and I thought it was the best thing since sliced bread because it would pull data off this device, it would tell me what was going to happen, give me prompts about actions to take. What more could you possibly want? So because we were pulling all this data in, and because I was the world's best guinea pig at pressing the button every time I did something, we had all the data you could possibly need to predict into the future what was going to happen based on the insulin, the food that I was eating, and anything else that was happening. But within a year, we started talking with other people. I was so enamored with this idea of open source, of people freely sharing with others. I was like, we have to share our solution because I know I'm not the only one who's afraid to go to sleep at night. I know I'm not the only one who sleeps through their alarms. It's a very, very common problem with type 1 diabetes. So as we talked to other people, we learned different things about what you could do with open source. We learned that the FDA frowns on distributing code that looks like a medical device, even if it's not a medical device. And so we actually didn't share our first initial system. But along the way, we started meeting different people who were doing different cool open source things in diabetes. We met this awesome guy named Ben West, who had spent years figuring out how to talk to the insulin pump. Well, a very particular type of insulin pump. And it turns out that was an insulin pump I had, and the light bulb went off again, that we actually had everything that we needed in our pockets, relatively speaking, in the household, to build a closed-loop artificial pancreas system. Because you take that same dumb CGM that you plug in, and that same dumb pump that you could talk to now thanks to Ben's work, and you plug in a small Linux machine, in our case it was a Raspberry Pi, a little radio stick to talk to the pump, and a battery, and you end up with a closed-loop artificial pancreas system. And why this system matters, this looks big, this looks clunky, but remember what we did in manual diabetes. Human doing everything 100 times a day. That's not a job for a human to read data off one machine and from another and process it and then take a small action. That is a job for a computer. So you take that CGM, talk to a computer, take the pump, make it talk to the computer, and you make it make the decisions every 5 minutes based on the change in blood sugar. That's how you get a closed-loop artificial pancreas system, and the human can still intervene. This human can still do whatever they want, make good decisions, bad decisions, whatever, but the computer is there in the background, monitoring, making small decisions, and reacting much more quickly than the human could, whether you're awake and just not paying attention because you're talking to a room full of people, you're working, you're chasing your kids, whatever, or you're sleeping. Again, the primary goal there. So what does a closed-loop artificial pancreas system look like today? It looks like this, and if you see me walking around, you may not even notice mine, unless you notice a little red light on mine. This is an open source hardware board, that's what's pictured on screen. On the back side is an Intel Edison, as well as my pump, my CGM, and then an open source visualization tool we call Night Scout, where you can see what the blood sugar is doing. The little purple line is the predictions, which is telling the system, here's what the blood sugar is going to do. It decides how much insulin to give, and then the blue lines oscillating are more and less insulin compared to my baseline. So how does this work for those of you without diabetes? Remember, the graphs before looked something like this. Within the first week, overnight, my blood sugar started looking like this. And the reason this matters, this all goes back to sleep. So this was 4 years ago. Now imagine this week, we flew over from the United States. We did Seattle to SFO to Auckland to here. And SFO to Auckland is a very long flight, about 13 hours. And I got about 5 hours of sleep, which meant that I was a little sleep deprived. I usually like about 9.5 hours. So Tuesday night when we went to sleep, or sorry, Monday night when we went to sleep, I slept for 13 hours. And this is what my blood sugars did. No worries, no concerns. It didn't matter how sleep deprived I am, what time zone I'm in, when I was waking up, when I went to bed, what I had for dinner, what was going on in the world, lunar eclipse, doesn't matter. I don't have to worry. So that is the beauty of the system. But remember, I was helped by multiple people along the way when we built the system. I didn't want to keep it to myself, and I didn't feel ethically like I could because it was so impactful. So we decided to open source this project, and that's why we call it Open APS, the Open Source Artificial Pancreas System. And it was this idea of a movement more than a particular project. It wasn't about the hardware, it wasn't about the pump, but it was this idea of, hey, we can make really safe and effective basic artificial pancreas systems. And we want to do everything we can to help anybody who wants to do this be able to do so anywhere in the world and help them reduce their burden of living with type 1 diabetes. It's not a cure, but it makes a huge difference in quality of life. So we decided to open source this. And one of the first things that we did, so when I first built my smart alarm system, what was essentially an open loop system, because it would tell me what to do and I would take the action, we didn't realize at the time it was an open loop. But we spent so much time working on the algorithm, we really understood how it worked. So we first wrote in plain language, here are all the ways that it works, and here, more importantly, are all the ways it's going to fail. Not if it fails, when it fails. These are the ways that we know it's going to fail, because you are going to rip your pump side out, or if you're like me, when I was going between Auckland and Christchurch, my backpack caught my continuous glucose monitor sensor and partially ripped it out. And you have to be prepared of what if you lose the sensor data, the glucose data that goes into the system? What if you can't dose the insulin? What if the battery on your rig or your pancreas dies? What if the battery on your pump dies and turns off the radio communications? What if you run out of insulin? There's so many ways that this thing is going to fail, and we pretty much designed for those. And it's really interesting when we talk with people from kind of traditional healthcare, they're like, oh, what if? And at the end of the conversation, we say, well, here's our design, and here's all the ways we know it's going to fail. They're like, wow, you spent a lot of time thinking about safety. Yes. Yes, we did. And the reason we spent so much time thinking about safety is because we are the people with type 1 diabetes. We are the people that are diagnosed, handed a vial of a lethal drug, and sent home saying, good luck. That's literally what happens when you're diagnosed with type 1. Some people get more or less education. Some people are hospitalized for a couple days. But at the end of whatever little education series you get, you go home and it is up to you. 99.99% of decision making is done by the person with diabetes. There are very few healthcare conditions where that happens. So people with diabetes, they have to figure it out or they don't stay alive. So those of us walking around with type 1 diabetes have done a lot of experimenting, a lot of failing, but then a lot of getting up and trying again. So when we designed the system, we of course focused on safety, but we thought about what are the limits that we can set on hardware as well as the software. You see, there's a very key part of this story that a lot of people, especially the tech people, like to focus on, which is the security and the safety of the devices. Wait, how are you talking to the pump? Well, it turns out we're actually using a known security hole or flaw that caused the pump to be recalled off the US market. So we are using these old insecure pumps because the security flaw was that you could talk to the pump over the radio. Well, that's what allows us to talk to the pump over the radio and close the loop. But because we have hardware limits on the pump about how much insulin you can dose, we have software limits that you can set. They're set very conservatively by default when you install the open source software. It starts with basically reduce insulin for safety, don't give any more unless the person says give it more, and that person can specify how much more. We respond to unexpected data. Like if weird fluky data comes in, we're not just responding to a single data point. We design to look at the trend, the predictions, if you're missing data, if you get a common error that we call the 3 question marks, where the sensor says, I'm not giving you any more data because something's weird is happening. We've designed for that. But the number one thing we designed for is we worked with the system. It's designed where you get what's called a basal rate. So kind of your baseline amount of insulin throughout the day. That's the dumb part where if you're gonna go low, it keeps dosing that baseline amount of insulin. Kind of bad. So what we do is we send what's called a temporary basal rate command that only lasts for 30 minutes. With the idea that if the system is working and it makes another decision in 5 minutes, it's gonna send another command and overwrite the last 30-minute rate. But if for some reason the system fails, it gets stuck, somebody takes it and runs away because they're so excited about it, the battery dies for whatever reason, you fall back at the end of the 30 minutes to your pre-programmed gold standard of care insulin pump. So you fall back to the gold standard if this thing breaks, and that's how we designed it. So if you're interested in a lot more details about the safety and all the design things, I'd love to talk about it with you. If you don't have time to talk about it with me here, I will point you to openaps.org is where we have our plain language reference design. And I emphasize plain language because I used to say English, then I realized it's not actually just the English part that matters, but it's the plain language because we have had a lot of people over the years who've come in and done this project for themselves. They're not technical people. And in fact, many people take a lot of convincing that they can do this, that they can try to do this. So we really emphasize that people should start with the plain language reference design because it's written as a person with diabetes for the rest of the world saying, here's how you treat your diabetes. Here's how we taught the computer to do the same thing. In fact, it was me teaching my husband, here are the rules to deal with type 1 diabetes. If this, then that. That made us realize we could teach the computer. It's a lot easier to teach a computer than a human because the computer will do what you tell it to. Humans get their own ideas. So anyways, the reference design is a great read. We also have tons of documentation and code open source, of course, online. But I want to point out, this is not just one person doing this. I've been looping now for a little over 4 years. There are actually multiple people in this room using closed-loop artificial pancreas systems, but around the world, there are over 1,000 people using different versions of these systems. And the reason that matters, yes, there are millions of people around the world with type 1 diabetes. So you may look and be like, psh, that's nothing. My project has 5 gazillion users. That's fine. This number surprises me because I only thought 2 or 3 people would end up using this. At the time, we thought everybody would switch over to a commercial product if and when it became available because we were just filling the gap. We said there's nothing else out there that will work. We're going to do something. We're going to make it work for ourselves. So it works so well, and we've been able to iterate on it because it's open source. We can just keep chipping away at the problems we find, improvements that we want to make, hardware, software, algorithm, usability features, whatever. But what's really surprised me is that people have continued to use this. So I ask people to tell me when they're looping, fill out a simple form, and I use that based on their start date, and if they tell me they're just using it overnight, or they're also using it 24/7, and I actually do a little bit of estimate to figure out how many days and hours of experience do we have. Right now, that number is somewhere around 9 million hours of experience across all the different DIY systems around the world. Conservative number of people, conservative number of hours. But this matters because if you look into healthcare and you look at the commercial devices that are being submitted for regulatory approval around the world, the pivotal trials, the big fancy clinical trials that are done to say this thing is ready to go to market, When that gets submitted to regulatory approval, a lot of those trials have 150,000 hours. 150,000 hours of study. Our community has chosen to keep using this for something around 9 million plus hours. So let me tell you, we have learned a lot. And this is what I'm talking about when I say open source is changing healthcare, because this data isn't just going to waste. I refuse to let it go to waste. We've built a data commons on a tool and a platform called Open Humans, which allows you to put your data and share it with projects and start research projects. And I refuse to let all this beautiful data go to waste, and I refuse to let the companies ignore it. So I've made this data set freely available. It's anonymized by the individual's data being donated. And if somebody requests me, it doesn't matter if you're a company, it doesn't matter if you're an individual, a data science, a person with diabetes, you can request access to this data and learn from it. How are people dosing differently with a closed loop system than not? What have we been able to do, such as completely eliminating manual interactions, something people thought could not be done until the second generation of the commercial systems. Many of us are doing that in the open source community. So how can we take the best of what we've learned and put it into the commercial devices that put it into the academic studies that are being done? And so we're starting to see that done, which is really fantastic. But I want to share at least 2 other anecdotes other than my love of sleep to tell you a little bit about why some people are using this. There are 2 gentlemen who quantified their experiences with Open APS that I think are pretty significant. One of them is a gentleman named Sulka Haro. He lives in Finland, and he has a young son with diabetes. And his son was very, very little when he was diagnosed, and they were tracking everything. So every time they touched the pump and had to make a manual correction, remember I said we make lots of decisions throughout the day, lots of manual corrections, they were having to chase their young 2-year-old son around and give them about 4.5 manual interventions a day. If you've ever had a 2-year-old, imagine making them eat something when they don't want to, or holding them down long enough to get a hold of their pump to press buttons for 30 seconds. That's hard. That's a lot of work. And that was mom, that was dad, that was grandparents, that was caregivers at school, the school nurse, whatever. That's a lot of work. So that's what's shown on the left. And over time, as they started Open APS, they gave it the ability to dose more insulin, switched insulins, added fancy features. Now they have to do less than 1 manual intervention per day. Again, almost 5 things per day versus less than 1 thing per day. That's pretty significant, especially when you're talking about a young child and the quality of life. Because when you have diabetes, it's not just your disease. You're the one who physically have it, but it impacts your parents, it impacts your siblings, it impacts your spouse, it impacts your loved ones. It really does impact the whole family. So this, to me, is really impactful of showing the whole family story of why people are choosing to do open source and DIY. It's because our quality of life kind of stinks sometimes with type 1 diabetes. It is so hard to do. And even if you get really good outcomes, Sulka is also really great about showing his glucose levels before and after his son went on an Open APS. The average glucose is the same, but the amount of work they have to do is so much less, and the peace of mind that they have, and probably the quality of life of a child growing up with diabetes, you can't quantify that, but I've got to think that's pretty amazing. And one other example I'll tell you about, Jason Whitmer's son has had diabetes, and in 4th grade, before they started Open APS, he found out that his son went to the school nurse about 420 times in a school year. So before lunch, after lunch, before gym, anytime he was low or high and had to get help treating, 420 times he left the classroom away from his peers. That's a lot of distraction from learning, right? Well, contrast that to after his son started using Open APS in 6th grade. 5 times. And Jason is also really great to follow on Twitter because he is very real and open about how his son uses Open APS. He's also, I think, an ICU doc, so he's talked about the time where he's looked down at the visualization tool he has and realized, my son just ate lunch and he forgot to put his carbs in. And so he'll be running down the hall, the dad will, in the ICU to go deal with the code whatever situation, and he'll be entering carbs for his son's pancreas across town at school. Which is pretty cool. The other nice thing about Internet of Things is making these things internet connected means that you can do what you want with it. So for me, having a glanceable display, I love my Pebble because I can just glance down and see, yeah, my blood sugar went up from the excitement, but my pancreas kicked in and it's heading down now and it's gonna be fine, especially when I calm down. But it's nice because if you are an Android phone user and you love your Android and you will never, ever, ever, ever go to an iDevice, that's fine. This thing will connect to your Android. If you are an iPhone diehard lover, that's fine too. I use an iPhone. You can see your stuff on your iPhone. You can get connectivity to that. If you want to say, hey Siri, I'm about to speak, set a higher target or a lower target or whatever, you can text your pancreas. You really can. You can press a button on your watch. That's my favorite way of doing it. It's very discreet. I just press 3 buttons and I can set a higher target, I can set a lower target, I can enter what I'm eating and nobody would know what I was doing. I don't have to pull out my medical device and fumble around, which is really, really common otherwise, or choose to step out of the room or go into the bathroom or do something like that. Imagine how nice the difference is of a job interview with type 1 diabetes with and without these devices. Having to decide if you go to an interview lunch, what do you do for your insulin dosing, whether you're injecting or pulling out your pump or dealing with that, when you don't really want to make diabetes the point of the conversation, but it kind of becomes the point of the conversation, even if you don't want that to be the focus. With this stuff, it doesn't have to be. So if you want to use Alexa, you want to use Google Home, you want to use this, that, the thing that hasn't come up with yet, yes, pretty much. And because it's open source, we have people come in all the time to the community and say, ooh, what about this? And we're like, hey, that's a cool idea, you should go do it. And they're like, what? We're like, yeah. You've got the device, I don't have that device, like you do it, I can coach you, I can help you, I'll help you review the pull requests, but like you go do it. So some of the coolest things have come from people in the community doing things where they're like, hey, this is my use case, I wanna make it better for me. Okay, great, let's do that. And one of my favorite examples is the hardware that we've used over time. So very early on, my system looked like this. So this big hunkin' Raspberry Pi 2 in a big black case with the big radio stick on top that actually had terrible range. This radio stick was designed just to read data off the pump, but what Ben West figured out is that you could also write to the pump, which was great, except for the range was about this big-ish, to the point where I had one under my mattress and dangling over the headboard at night, and then one on the bedside. So if I rolled over, I was triangulated between the signal. And I would carry this thing around along with my BlackBerry and everything else. That's my old hardware stack from late 2014. But there was a gentleman named Oscar Pearson in the UK, and he was like, look, my wife is a midwife. She has scrub pockets. This does not fit. We got to do something else. We're like, great, tell us what ideas you have. Like, we're not hardware people, not a traditional whatever, like, but tell us what you got. And so he started working with the Intel Edison platform, and he figured out a radio stick that worked with that, and he rewrote some radio software to allow us to use a different platform other than the Raspberry Pi. And so as a result of that, we fell in love with the Intel Edison because it's small, it's power efficient, it's tiny, it doesn't take this big honking case and battery. Really, really great. We actually met somebody who had a family connection to diabetes, had a hardware shop. He helped us build an open source board that was manufactured for the community, and that's what I'm wearing today. That's what's pictured in the top right, and that's what I'm wearing. Chapstick for scale. And then my European friends think it's really, really funny, so they gave me European chapstick and a unicorn, because I talk about unicorns sometimes, so they're there. But the reason I'm showing this is because, sadly, the Intel Edison was discontinued, and we are very, very sad. So side note, if you have Edison sitting around that you're not using, email me. I will find you a buyer, put them on eBay, please put them to good use. But because of that, we decided to go back to the Pi, because over time the Pi has gotten different and better. Everybody here got a Raspberry Pi Zero with headers, woo, and an SD card. If you don't want those, I'll take them, because that is half of an artificial pancreas. So we added what we call the Explorer hat to mimic the Explorer board, but it actually had a screen, because there were people in the community who said, hey, we go camping, we don't want to have to use our phone as a display, we'd love to have a screen right on the rig. We're like, great, build it. So they did. So now we have the Explorer hat with a screen and buttons, so you can see all the information you would see for some people. And so we have the Explorer hat. So we can basically play around with whatever hardware Linux machines we want to, which is really great. And again, it comes down to somebody has an idea, they come in, and just last week somebody said, ooh, there's this new radio thing, I think it would be cheaper than that, it doesn't have the screen, but some people might want that. Like, should we do something? I'm like, great, do it. Write the documentation, we'll put it in, no problem. So that's how kind of a lot of the coolest features of hardware have evolved, is people coming in and saying, I want to try this. And we're like, great, go forth, let's try it. Let's see if it works. If we get it documented, we can share it with the community and people start to use it, which is really, really great. So again, Internet of Things is awesome, but don't pin your hopes on one device if you're not the manufacturer, because sometimes it goes away. And you kind of have to deal with that. But the nice thing is there are so many devices you can use. You can use the Pi Zero, you can use the Pi 2, the 3, the whatever you want to use. You can even use just like a big clunking Linux machine on your laptop and plug in a radio stick. Not very portable, but for a bedside device, it works just fine. It reads the data, writes the data, it's all good. But I want to emphasize something. When you talk about diabetes, hopefully I've convinced you that it's not easy, and that the risk of living with diabetes is so big that adding on the additional risk and the issues that come with running a system like this outweigh it. The quality of life, the outcomes, the benefit. For most people who choose to run it, they decided yes. The people who don't choose to run it said, like, it's not worth it to me, or I don't like the security issues or whatever. But a lot of people think, well, how can you do this? You're not a doctor. You're not a coder. You're not a this. You're not a that. Like, who do you think you are to do this? And it's like, well, it's not rocket science. It's a little bit of code that's basically the same algorithm every person with diabetes learns when they're diagnosed. If your blood sugar is going high, give more insulin according to your settings. If your blood sugar is going low, give less insulin according to your settings. But the beauty of this is the computer is designed to do it every 5 minutes. That's probably hard to read. This is part of what's online, but I can also link it to you directly if you want to see this part. But this is what face I make in my computer anytime you say, but you're not a whatever. Because that's ridiculous. But the other reason I say this is because a lot of people who come from non-open source, non-technical backgrounds, myself included, it's hard because you're faced with a room full of amazing people with all this amazing intellect and you're like, ooh, what do I know? But the most important thing that I've learned in open source is the willingness to try. Absolutely, the most important skill is just the willingness to show up and to try and to ask questions. I have been blown away by the generosity and the kindness in the open source community. Technical people outside of healthcare, the healthcare open source community, it's been absolutely amazing. And this is what I tell to the rest of the world, especially healthcare, who's really hung up on, well, you're not a doctor, you're not this, you're not a that. I say, no, we're not engineers and we're not doctors and we're not whatever as our professional jobs, but we are engineering solutions. We are doing science experiments every single day as a person with diabetes. We have to research, we have to invent, because what's coming out is not coming out fast enough and it's not good enough. And that's why we're doing what we're doing. And the approach, you've probably seen a visual like this that talks about traditional innovation processes. But the way I describe it is that traditional healthcare companies and people working to bring healthcare products to market, they don't think that there's any value in bringing out a wheel. They can't sell a wheel, really. Like, their goal is a self-driving car, right? 5 years, self-driving car, it'll be out. Just wait, it'll be fine, right? Well, the reality is, it's not so much about the self-driving car. The root problem here is we want to go from point A to point B, and preferably with not as much work, because it's really, really hard, especially with type 1 diabetes. And we in the community are really good with saying, like, look, we don't know how to build a self-driving car or anything. We're not car manufacturers. We don't know what we're doing. But we do know really diabetes, and we understand the problem, and the root of the problem is how do we go from point A to point B? And hey, look, there's a block of wood and some wheels. Let's make a skateboard. It's better than nothing. So my first rig was a skateboard. It was big, it was clunky, it was ugly. People loved to laugh at it, but it worked. Closed the loop. I got to sleep for 12 hours and not worry. And over time, people came along and said, ooh, what if we change the hardware? Or what if we add a handlebar? Then you can steer and you have a scooter. And I should probably change this to be e-scooters because I love e-scooters now. But along the way, you can evolve all the way to the point where you have a car. And in the case of the open source diabetes community, we had the self-driving car 4 years ago, 3 years ahead of commercial manufacturers, and we didn't stop there. We have continued evolving and taking away a lot of the manual things that you have to do as a person with diabetes, even with this technology. And so the quality of life is really incredible. But I don't want you to think that this just applies to diabetes. There is so much good that people with open source can do. If you start looking around you and talking to the loved ones in your life, you probably know somebody with cancer, asthma, cystic fibrosis, some rare disease that most people haven't heard of, you name it. And if you ask them, like, what is your biggest problem? What is the thing that most annoys you? And like, once you get past like, well, I'd like a cure, and kind of those big picture things that you can't really tackle, start asking the questions about what could you tackle? For me, it was make a louder alarm. Just make a louder alarm. I can't fix all the problem with my devices, but if we can free the data, I can do something useful for it. And you can start chipping away and making solutions, and you end up with something so much bigger and so much better than you would have ever thought possible. And that's in the case of what we did with diabetes, but we're just at the tip of the iceberg of what can be done in healthcare and open source. So I challenge you to think about what could be done if you took your open source skills and started talking with people, your colleagues, your friends, your loved ones, and said, what could we do? How can we take what you do and apply it to this? It doesn't have to be a lot of time. The Open APS project, we did this all in our spare time. Nights and weekends of coding and working together, of talking to people on the internet around the world in different time zones. Nobody has been funded in the Open APS project to work on that work. So it's not about the money. I think Rory yesterday said it's about the impact. And I think that's absolutely true in healthcare. There is nothing more rewarding than seeing an open source project that you worked on really change somebody's life. Anytime I hear a story of somebody, whether it's Jason's son going to the school nurse less, Solka, and his son saying, I don't remember what it's like without Open APS, and thinking that's a good thing because his life is really good with diabetes, that's absolutely amazing. And I would love for y'all to have that opportunity, and I would love for y'all to lend your skills because, again, there's only so much time in a day. I only have 2 hands. My focus area is diabetes, but I'm really passionate about helping connect other people. So if you're like, look, I really want to help, but I don't know anybody out there with a problem, let me know. I can help you find you somebody in a patient community who's been looking for a technical person to partner with. Because really one of the most beautiful things about Open APS is the partnerships and the collaborations of the open source community. I didn't do this by myself. This is, it has always been a community project, people working together, sharing their skills, sharing their ideas, saying, what could we do next? What could we do together? That to me is really the beauty of open source. So I will just close by saying there's actually two other kinds of people in the room. Those who are willing to do open source in healthcare and those who will not. And I'm hoping that after today, more of y'all will be in the group who will be considering how can we take our open source stuff, our tech stuff, our Linux stuff, what can we do in healthcare today? Because we're not going to wait to change, and I want you to help. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just wait a minute. That was truly inspirational, and as a small token of our appreciation, I'd like to give you with that. Thank you.